So Robert, the Royal Incorporation and the Festival of Architecture 2016. It is, I think, appropriate for Christmas time that I'm going to dwell on things past, things present, and things yet to come. Although, unlike in Mr. Dickens' story, the portents are all, I think, pretty positive. My subjects are all inextricably linked. The first is a truly remarkable man. The second, his legacy, an organisation that on the 2nd of November this year celebrated its 99th anniversary. My third topic is the ambitious festival that the Royal Incorporation is planning for its centenary year. Along the way, I'll also attempt to describe a century of Scottish architecture, a century of unprecedented social and technological change, and the architecture and indeed some of the architects who reflected that and played their part in it. First, the architect of the National Portrait Gallery and one of Scotland's great unsung or certainly undersung heroes, Sir Robert Rowand Anderson. Whenever anyone's asked to consider Edinburgh's extraordinary heritage, there's a quite understandable tendency to talk about the medieval charms of the old town, the Georgian glories of the new town, and the contrast between the two. And then there's the real delights of the old, the herringbone pattern of streets and closes, the Frenchified Corby-stepped gables, and the refinement of the new town, the built expression of the cultural, creative, and philosophical ferment of the Scottish Enlightenment. The embodiment, of course, of James Craig's 1767 competition-winning master plan, which translated the stratified society which dwelt in the old town's tenements into broad boulevards of grand dwellings. These in turn are intersected by the more densely dwelt retail thoroughfares of the middle class, all stepping down in scale to the lanes behind with the service accommodation. Ask even the best informed about Edinburgh's great architecture, and the tale is one quite rightly focused on the 18th and early 19th century. On the Adam brothers, there's James and Robert, and of course on William Playfair. The neoclassical revival, which Robert Adam spawned, influenced the evolution of cities across Europe, throughout the Russias, and as far afield as the nascent cities of the United States. Playfair followed Adam on some projects, including Old College, quite literally. Although he's a more local phenomenon, nevertheless, he designed some of the monuments, which led to Edinburgh's designation as the Athens of the North. And before you scream that he didn't design that, he was involved in the creation of that. So what of my specialist subject, dear old Sir Robert Rowand Anderson? Born in 1834, not architecturally active until the late 1850s, he was, of course, far too late to be part of the great expansion of Edinburgh's northern flanks. He was, by all accounts, difficult, vain, opinionated, self-centred, and prone to anger. Indeed, he seems to have spent much of his life fairly determinedly falling out with some quite influential people, even on occasion in the courts. Yet Rowand Anderson was also undoubtedly a genius, passionate about history, an internationalist, dedicated, determined, hard-working, and for those few who broke through his all-too-evident barriers, a true and loyal friend. He built some of the most substantial and significant Scottish buildings of the Victorian era and was well ahead of his time in understanding the value of historic buildings. As one of the first true conservationists, he influenced the Scottish conservation movement, which would later become such a powerful lobby, particularly in the period after the Second War. Rowand Anderson's influence on Scottish architecture is immeasurable and endures to this day. A quick CV of the great man and his achievements. He was born at Liberton, the third child of James Anderson, a solicitor, educated at George Watson's. He initially followed his father into law. That didn't work out, and by 1849 he's attending classes at the Trustees' Drawing Academy, which later became Edinburgh College of Art, with Anderson as one of its founding trustees. Initially articled to an Edinburgh architect in 1857, he becomes an assistant to George Gilbert Scot's office just off Trafalgar Square in London. Scot, perhaps the most significant individual influence on Anderson, was prolific, with a major commercial, education and church practice and a tremendous passion for and understanding of architectural history. Later, of course, he would design the second largest neo-Gothic building in these Isles, after the Houses of Parliament, the University of Glasgow, of course, in its new setting at Gilmore Hill. In the late 1850s, Anderson travelled through Europe, developing significant linguistic skills and even working for a short period for a leading Dutch practice. In 1860, he returns to Edinburgh and spends much of the next decade honing his skills as a civilian employee of the Royal Engineers. Alongside work on coastal defences, he starts a private practice, designing Gothic-style churches in Edinburgh, St Andrews, Cooper and Alloa. He leaves the Royal Engineers and puts up his own plate in 1868. For the next 3 decades, he's highly successful and prolific, designing some of Edinburgh's most ambitious and impressive large buildings. He wins competitions for the Catholic Apostolic Church, now, of course, the Mansfield Traquair Centre, and for Edinburgh University's Faculty of Medicine and the McEwen Hall, both drawing heavily upon further international travels and in the northern Italian tradition. He puts a new dome on Old College and, of course, produces what's inarguably Edinburgh's finest secular Gothic building, the red sandstone Flemish-inspired National Portrait Gallery. Elsewhere in Scotland, he's also doing well, designing the highly embellished Mount Stuart for the Marquess of Bute, Glasgow Central Station, and both Govan Old Parish Church, known also as Govan Cathedral because of its sheer scale, and the Pearce Institute Govan, in the centre of the industrial heartland of West Scotland. Alongside all of these grand buildings, Anderson and his various partners, co-consultants and employees are working on literally dozens of individual houses, extensions, adaptations and reconfigurations of all sorts of buildings. And in the process, he's becoming very, very wealthy. He's also falling out with fellow architects. His practice goes through at least 5 significant permutations and 1 major lawsuit, and institutions. He's variously a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects and a Royal Scottish Academician, then not a member of either, having fallen out with various individuals on points of principle. Then in his late years, he's rejoined to both, awarded a knighthood for his work at Balmoral, and he becomes a hero, albeit a cantankerous hero, of the establishment. All the above said, and trust me, I've barely started to describe the breadth of this man and his achievements. His conservation practice is a whole other facet and an aspect of his career which would influence later generations. He restored Jedburgh and Paisley Abbeys, worked on Holyrood Palace, became a favourite of the royal family and was an early campaigner against the loss of heritage driven by the industrial and particularly the railways expansionism of the age. He protested the loss of the university buildings on Glasgow's High Street, somewhat ironic because it was his friend and mentor Gilbert Scot who got the job to replace them. The conviction of salvage bits in the 17th century college in Pierce Lodge, and of course the rebuilding of the Lion and Unicorn staircase at Professor Square were both helped along by his protestations. In 1893, he founded the School of Applied Art in Edinburgh, subsequently Edinburgh College. In 1895, he instituted the National Arts Survey to record all pre-18th century buildings. And finally, to crown Robert Rowand Anderson's illustrious career, is arguably his most significant legacy. With further irony, it all comes about when Sir Robert was given the ultimate architectural accolade by the Royal Institute of British Architects, their gold medal. He was well into his 80s by the time he receives the gold medal for architecture, and not very well. So he declined to travel to London. Instead, his Scottish Supporters Club, a very influential bunch of mainly architects, decided to hold a dinner in his honour. As often happens, both drink and great ideas flowed. It emerged that although the event was prompted by an award from the Royal Institute of British Architects, most of those around the large dining table felt that the RIBA was remote, didn't really serve Scotland very well, and that architectural governance from closer to home seemed like a very good idea. I make no comment nor draw any analogy with any current ongoing political stooshy. So, appropriately, some might say that the Scottish architects' body, the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, was born at a boozy dinner table. Its first president, needless to say, was Sir Robert Rowan Anderson himself, followed in quick succession by his distinguished pals, Sir J.J. Burnet and Sir Robert Lorimer. In the years to come, they determined that their new organisation would not be an institute. It would incorporate Scotland's 5 existing area societies for architects, the Aberdeen Society, the Dundee Institute, the Edinburgh Architectural Association, the Inverness Architectural Association, and the Glasgow Institute of Architects. It would in time also promote a new architectural body for Stirling to ensure Scotland-wide federal governance from the start of the incorporation of architects in Scotland. Now, I mentioned earlier that Robert Rowan Anderson, in the course of his illustrious career, became very wealthy. When he died in 1921, predeceased by his wife by only a few months, he left one of his townhouses to the incorporation. He had 2. Along with his second best silver. His best silver and porcelain he gifted to the Palace of Holyrood House. So much better was it than what they already had. The gift was perhaps something of a sweetener because he had one last posthumous favour to ask of his friend King George V. It was a condition of the gift of 15 Rutland Square that the incorporation should petition the king for a royal charter, and that the charter should be awarded within 2 years. Now, if you think about that in contemporary terms, just you try asking the Queen to give you a charter double quick. I don't actually expect you would meet with enormous success, but such was the influence of Rowan Anderson, even post-mortem, that the charter was duly awarded. It was the last presumption of a man who'd been pushy for a lifetime. The Incorporation's charter was duly awarded in 1922, and in due course the epithet Royal was given to the architectural profession in Scotland, which has the distinction of being one of the very few professions in these isles with 2 royal charters. So, the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland is born, and we'll just have a quick romp through 99 years. We're at the point that Sir Robert has gifted the incorporation to the architects of Scotland, indeed, arguably to the nation. And if this were this time next year, a group of 10 historians would have pored over the extensive archive of the incorporation and written up a beautiful centenary publication. And would that I had that centenary publication today, but unfortunately we're at this time this year. So I had 2 options, and in my endeavour to compress what would take 10 people a year to do into the relatively shorter period I had for this lecture, the first alternative was to pore through the minute books of the incorporation and the council reports. Roughly, I calculate 20,000 pages of close-typed A4 script, or wing it by riffling through the pages of the RIAS quarterly, and strangely, I decided on the latter course. So my survey of the incorporation's endeavours is totally ad hoc. I've added a little bit of additional spice from my own knowledge, in that I work out that I've had 35 years of association with the incorporation. First off, a quick paraphrase of the incorporation's objectives, which remain more or less as set out by Sir Robert and his colleagues in 1916. First, to organise and unite the architects of Scotland and combine their efforts for the advancement of architecture. Second, to support and encourage the study of Scotland's architecture. Third, to serve the interests of the profession. And fourthly, to collect and publish on the theme of architecture. So now for that rapid romp. In the 1920s, it was just getting going. The quarterly reported on matters of architectural history, the pontifications of presidents on the weighty issues of the day, a fair amount of learning from abroad stuff, and both chapter and technical reports. So from 1928, Continental Impressions by John Watson Jr., illustrated articles on Rome and Marseille, student submissions, including Mervyn Node's The Influence of the Low Countries in the Architecture of Scotland, including this delightful Geneva sketch. In 1929, there were articles on George Meikle Kemp, the author, of course, of this splendid object, who died in March 1884, as you will recall, before the completion of his great work. And Meikle Kemp was a craftsman joiner to trade, and won the competition to create this splendid edifice. But sadly, before it was finished, one night he was walking along beside the Union Canal, and to quote from the RIAS Quarterly, on the following day a hat and cane were found floating near the spot that bespoke of the dreadful tragedy that had occurred. So poor old George falls in the canal and drowns. Spanish ironwork, another topic in 1930. The Scottish architect who built the Louvre, who knew that? I think rather stretching the point that Pierre Lescaut was Peter the Scot. He might have been Peter the Scot going back several generations and had some Scottish antecedents, but I suspect he wasn't truly Scottish. But, you know, let's claim it all for ourselves anyway, truly patriotic. There were notes on contemporary French work, 3 long essays on Glasgow and its buildings, the Tweed bridges. By the 1930s, the incorporation is really getting into its stride. Appreciations of Mackintosh, Alexander Thomson, an appreciation of the work of the great Aberdonian architect, Alexander Marshall Mackenzie. Dr. Mackenzie's architecture is altogether human in its qualities, eminently satisfying in its amplitude, breadth and simplicity. It's impressed with the dignity of its own personality. He appreciated with a thorough understanding circumstances and environment, space and substance, materials and textures. His amazing versatility enabled him to add to a Scottish baronial castle or to design Gothic or Renaissance buildings with teleological fitness and assured dignity and grace that compel admiration. So there we go. RIAS Convention, Stirling, and that's Marshall Mackenzie. And that's quite a lot of architects at the Stirling Convention, 1st and 2nd June 1934. So you can all look up there for pictures of Grandpa. The retiring President, John Begg, in his valedictory address commented, "We want to educate not only ourselves, but also the people of this country by every means we can legitimately and honourably employ." So high aspirations there. The British Architects Conference at Glasgow, the following year, Professor T. Harold Hughes on the subject of contemporary art. I think 90% of modern work in art, music, painting and sculpture is pure rubbish. I really think it's a disease, an insidious disease, but I think at this conference we ought to try to take some steps to do something about it. So there we have T. Harold Hughes opining against modernity. An essay in the same issue of the Quarterly by Rendell Govan, winner of the Quarterly Essay Prize, comments, "The whole point of the first question, that of the honest use of materials, is that the new movement is using what are loosely called new materials, by which are used most of the pre-war architects who, however, built around them as if to conceal their existence. This was because the styles in which they worked dated from days when these materials were not available. In other words, steel and concrete were foreign to the styles in use, so that in preserving the style, no expression was given to the real structural members, or else, on the other hand, if these members were used to capacity, the styles as imposed upon them were strained and unnatural." I will come back to that point. He compares, in his essay, a house, prize-winning house, EA prize for a £1,100 house, which is about £85,000 in present-day terms, by a certain Robert H. Matthew, competition winners, and he compares that to that, the Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier, of course. Many decades later, this same issue was commented upon by Erich Stein, and I actually think that this illustration is exactly what Izzy was talking about. Economic pressures and new materials and forms of construction and equipment, such as the steel and concrete skeleton, the elevator, mechanical ventilation, artificial light, and new claddings, destroyed the stone culture and destroyed with it the unity and diversity of a stone architecture. Buildings of the 30s, more often than not, were Trojan horses of concealed modernity, which used glass, steel, concrete, and glazed brick with astonishing originality, but in places that were not obvious, such as in atria and back elevations. So the point that Rendell Govan is making, and that Izzy Metstein makes sometime later, is that this sort of thing is, in their view, inherently dishonest. It's what Izzy later referred to as paving up walls. In 1937, there were articles on trees and towns, modern methods in Dutch architecture. In 1938, the frontispiece was the Tower of Empire from the Glasgow Empire Exhibition. And then there was a lecture to Edinburgh College of Art by the designer of this building, Erich Mendelsohn, of course, who, of course, we are in 1938, had fled from the oppressive regime in Germany and arrived initially in the United Kingdom before heading for the USA ultimately. Erich Mendelsohn gave his talk in 1938, and I actually some years ago had the privilege of talking to his host for that talk, who was by that time Sir William Kinnenmuth. Now, William Kinnenmuth died in 1988, but I had a really interesting interview, and I'll come back to it in a minute. To quote from Erich Mendelsohn's piece at Edinburgh College of Art, 1938, "Thus what the inventor imagined would prove a blessing to mankind and a boon to its progress works now, controlled by the animalistic instincts of man to the detriment of mankind, and with the mass production of his engines of war threatens to destroy the fabric of our civilization so laboriously raised through the centuries. We must understand, too, that human inertia and laziness ignores these gloomy consequences so long as it does not feel them at work in its own body." He then goes on to talk, now remember he's giving a talk in Edinburgh, about this island called England, which is obviously calculated to endear him to a Scottish audience. However, he actually caused even greater offence later the same day. William Kinnenmuth invited him back to 46 Adick Place for something to eat. And there he met Caroline Kinnenmuth. And when Willie was telling me this in 1984, Caroline Kinnenmuth had sadly quite recently died, so Willie was feeling fragile about that and still upset about that. He was also still upset about this event that had happened nearly 50 years previously. Mendelsohn comes into the house and Kinney's wedding present to his wife is on the wall. And it's a beautiful painting by Sir William Gillis. Very, very attractive, large Gillis oil painting. And evidently Erich Mendelsohn stood in front of this, and Kinney told me, and even adopted the German accent, Mendelsohn stood in front of the William Gillis picture and said, "This man cannot paint," and caused huge offence. And Kinney turned to me after telling me this story and said, "Erich Mendelsohn was a bombastic bastard." And you think, there is real passion 50 years after the event. And it wasn't because of the insult to Sir William Gillis, it was because of the insult to his wife. And I thought that was a very telling moment. And I've spoken to his daughter and his son-in-law about that since. And they did confirm my view that Sir William Kinnenmuth was an extremely polite man. Rarely did he rise to anger. But that was an indication of something that had obviously caused him a sort of fundamental and lifelong pain and hurt. And it was just, it was quite an interesting revelation for myself as the sort of young interviewer. On the 38 exhibition, a later reflection by Izzy Metstein seems pertinent. I suspect that the temporariness of the Empire exhibition gave its modernity an acceptable fix. In my view, modernity is only often acceptable in Scotland and elsewhere if associated with temporariness. We're quite happy with modernity if it's not intended to last. Nevertheless, the exhibition represented a significant change in form, if not in content, and its emergence from the depression of the 20s and 30s signalled the new faith in the future. In the 40s and 50s, during the period of the war, the quarterly ceases publication. It stops in 1940 and resumes in May 1946, and the pace really picks up as we move into the 1950s, and you see quite a substantial shift. You see a shift onto Sinclair Goldie commenting on architecture and stagecraft with these two, and then more extreme, this constructivist design. The convention in 46 is at Inverness, In 1948, we get some more reflections on architecture in Aberdeen, including that magnificent object by A.G.R. Mackenzie. In November 1949, as ever, the magazine throughout its history featured reports from the chapter, and I do think this is the best ever chapter report. In 1950, annual convention was in Edinburgh. There was an introduction by the President, Lockhart Hudson. May I add a few words on topics of general interest to the profession? First, I may remind you that we're non-political. So this is an assertion of the fact that the Incorporation is a very broad church. As a composite body, we carry out loyally the policy of the government of the day, whatever our own opinions. I'm not sure that this is entirely true of now, as individuals may be, which, remembering that our incorporation must contain members of all shades of political opinion, is just as it should be. The evolution of the castle in Aberdeenshire is described, and then in 1951 we get a description of the Festival of Britain. This is the Kelvin Hall Festival of Britain by Basil Spence. And Basil Spence's comment is, we had one motto for the Kelvin Hall, and that was, think big. As with British heavy industry, bigness is in its character. 1952, a piece on architecture and the decorative arts by Sir Hugh Casson. So far as architecture is concerned, sculpture has three important roles to play. We can call them informative, decorative, and associative. By informative, I mean such straightforward features as the royal coat of arms over the door of a government building. By decorative, I mean the use of sculpture to provide areas of surface enrichment. By associative, I refer not to literary association, but the use of sculpture physically separate from, but placed in association with buildings such as the fountain, the freestanding sculptural group, and so forth. In 1952, the British Architects Conference, so that's the whole of the UK, comes to Edinburgh in June, and there's reflections on Dudok, again, notes from the chapters, including that doodle. The architect was essentially a town bird, is the note that accompanies that. In winter 1956, church architecture, Mackintosh and Sullivan, post-war church architecture, stained glass, and you'll note a remarkable transition. That's colour. By the mid-1950s, the Quarterly has started to focus on new preoccupation for the profession, town planning. So this is something quite new. Miracle in the Gorbals, an essay by Ninian Johnson. Whether people would subsequently reflect on that as miraculous is open to debate. East Kilbride Town Centre. This sort of stuff is quite significant in the latter part of the 1950s, that all of a sudden you're getting considered plans of proposals for major town centres. And you're also getting an examination of historic architecture. This is in the summer of 1957. Fantastic guide with these beautiful sketched maps of the city of Edinburgh. The convention was in Edinburgh that year, speakers including Robert Matthew, and there was a tree planting by Mrs. Esme Gordon on the Sunday, so I'm sure everybody turned out for that. There also was that particular ad, which I just like the caption in that. We must consider the people's health and give them good quality sanitary ware. And I like these two chaps who are going to give us good quality sanitary ware. They look entirely appropriate to the task. And then we've got articles towards the end of the decade on Auchmuty School Gunrothes, a plea for wrought iron by Harry Jefferson Barnes, boss of Glasgow School of Art, ultimately, and Five Houses by Peter Womersley. This is in the winter of 1958. And you can see the progress that's been made. We've gone from comparisons of the Robert Matthew pitched roof house to an acceptance that this sort of thing might actually be appropriate. Then some pieces on some flat-roofed Cumbernauld stuff, articles on the landscape of Japan, stone building, a really interesting reflective article on Frank Lloyd Wright by Alan Reich. And Alan Reich writes very amusingly. He visited Wright twice in his lifetime and spent significant periods, this one at Taliesin West. And he quotes Frank Lloyd Wright saying to him in conversation, "What modern architecture needs today, young man, is more love." Which is very profound. But he also said that on these visits, he must have emerged sort of plumper than when he started, because on each visit, he'd go down and join the students in the morning, and then he would be called by the Wright family to partake of a second breakfast. He didn't realise that he was there as the honoured guest of Frank Lloyd Wright himself, and therefore he wasn't supposed to breakfast with the students. So this happened to him on 2 successive visits. You'd have thought after the first one he might have twigged, but on 2 successive visits he had to have 2 breakfasts in order to not let the great man down. And then at the end of the 1950s, just as the rest of the world is starting to get interesting, the incorporation starts a slow decline. For the next 2 decades, it's still undertaking its business, serving the profession, but it's mouldering quietly in its historic HQ, which is running down gently. By the late 1970s, it's generally felt that this once lively organisation is in terminal decline, and it will simply have to hitch its wagon to the Royal Institute of British Architects, and that will be the end of it. However, cometh the hour, cometh the man. In 1979, the arrival of a new secretary in the form of the firebrand Glaswegian via London, Charles McKean, gives the incorporation a new sense of purpose. He restores the building, fires up the membership's engagement enthusiasm, reinvents the annual convention, launches a major study of the 1930s, inaugurates a year-long Festival of Architecture in 1984, and launches a whole series of publications, in particular the RIAS handheld guide to Scottish buildings. He also ensures that the quarterly is back up and running. So there's all of that, and you can even see a photograph of me in Stygian darkness somewhere there. There's Scot-style Festival of Architecture 1984, the top 100 buildings in Scotland with their dates thoroughly pogled so that there's 1 per year. Don't rely on any dates in that book, incidentally. I made that mistake recently. Scottish 30s, a preoccupation of Charles McKean's, and indeed the reason for my first knocking at the incorporation's door in 1982. I went from studying that very exhibition, the Glasgow Empire exhibition at Glasgow University, to joining the 1930s committee with people like the aforementioned Alan Rioch and some greats of the Scottish architectural scene at the time. The start of the series of illustrated guides, quite extraordinary undertaking, and by the time it's finished, there is little doubt, and indeed if we get the opportunity to translate these into an online version of the guides, there's little doubt that Scotland will have, if not the best recorded architecture of any nation on planet Earth, then certainly among the best. Now, winter 1984, Andrew Merrill's postal sorting office. I actually just put that up there because obviously this is a building which has come and gone, and I just particularly liked the sculptural display there, which was a flourish by Andrew at the front entrance of that. And the 1930s study, I had mentioned previously, this is Roger Emerson writing about our work in the 1930s. We actually ultimately ran several years of a fairly detailed, intensive study in the 1930s that recorded every building of the decade as far as we could ascertain, and ended up, there's a very substantial, it's obviously all paper archive, because at that time it was typed up notes on sheets of paper that went into the National Archives. So it's all sitting as part of a huge collection of folders of descriptions, thousands upon thousands of buildings from the 1930s. Pretty substantial effort. We couldn't get a typeface that looked 30s enough for the 30s, oddly. So my late father drew that one as a sort of takeoff of something that looked appropriately 30-ish. Total aside. The conventions were starting to get more exciting, lots of international reference. And then we had some fairly major architectural competitions. The MacLeod Centre Iona, one of the largest in terms of sheer number of submissions, won by Field and Clegg, as they were at that time, now the renowned Field and Clegg Bradley. I was at an event in London last year where a young lady came over and introduced herself as from Field and Clegg Bradley, and I said, oh, I was involved in your very first job. I helped to write the brief for the MacLeod Centre Iona. And she looked at me as if I had come from the most ancient of ancient history imaginable. It's at these points that you realise that you are actually antediluvian, but there we go. Tollcross Fire Station, it's still the most postmodern building in Scotland. The convention in Aberdeen, Vico Magistrati, indicated that he liked Scotland for its golf, cashmere jerseys, marmalade, and Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Professor Andy McMillan commented, the food at yesterday's lunch was terrible. The food last night was terrible. The band was terrible. And yet the convention was wonderful. I don't understand it. There must be some sort of magic. And then in 1988, we've got the Glasgow Garden Festival. 1993, I'm jumping a bit forward, but I just loved that particular illustration from Alda van Eyck. I do like the simple notion that good buildings haven't got what they needn't have. It's quite a nice little definition of a good building. Spring 94, John Forbes writing in the Quarterly, the developer is merely an enabler if he's good, a wide boy if he's bad. Banks understand numbers. They rarely, with all due respect, have any interest in design. Consequently, if the numbers can be made to look more attractive by reducing the building costs and cutting the fees, then the developer is performing well, at least in the eyes of the bank. In the private sector, particularly in the area of speculative development, what chance has design? Autumn 94, Prospect was being produced by a Belfast company, and horrible punning was the order of the day for its headlines. Those headlines included The Lyceum Takes a Bow, Harbouring Doubts for an article on derelict docklands, The Boontown Flats for an article on Carrick Quay, Glasgow, Where Land Meets D, the new Robert Gordon's residencies, and worst of all, Key to the City. Mind you, summer 95, still in the hands of the Irish folk, gave that issue a run for its money in an issue on stadia. Winter 94-95, Ian Begg's extraordinary new house for himself. And then in the spring, an article by yours truly on how Glasgow, sorry to bring up old misfortunes in Edinburgh, but how Glasgow won City of Architecture and Design 1999. It was all chicanery and you were conned. I can reveal that now. And of course, in 1996, Charles McKean goes off to Dundee to be succeeded by his deputy, Sebastian Toombs. Actually, it's quite obvious that Sebastian wasn't going to last because he's sitting in the president's chair. It's a presumption too far. He did manage to last for a good few years, and by summer 99, Prospect has been produced by a Glasgow company. Quotes from an article by Penny Lewis at that point, architecture's definitely in. The public showed more interest in the selection of the architect for the Scottish Parliament building than in the selection of the MSPs. There's more about architecture in newspapers, magazines, on television than ever before, yet architects continue to be attacked and pilloried for being arrogant and aloof. So there we are. Let's hope that has changed a little bit. And then, of course, there was that article. As I say, this is about popularising, and it's being produced by a commercial company, and I find myself slightly uncomfortable, particularly usage number 3. Which uses the misfortune of St Stephen's, Renfield St Stephen's Church as a proposition for advertising Viagra, but there we go. Scottish Parliament landscape in May 2004, and a lovely profile with beautiful photographs of the American landscape architect Martha Schwartz. In May 2005, there's a profile of Sebastian Tombs just before he goes off to his new job at Architecture and Design Scotland. In the 1960s, it was not clear whether there was enough will in Scotland for a body separate from the RIBA. He then talks about the revitalisation of the incorporation by the great Charles McKean. And in March 2001, we agreed to relocate from Rutland Square. All of that, I'm happy to say, has subsequently changed. We've most assuredly determined to stay at Rutland Square. The next significant chapter for the incorporation is the last decade, the lead up to the incorporation centenary. The RIAS has continued to publish. In spring 2010, the quarterly comes back in-house. From its very first issue, the New Style magazine reflects the changes in a devolved Scotland. Many of the old features are back. Presidents opine, lively interviewees are cross-examined. The Doolan Award is raising the public profile of architecture. Education and conservation are still to the fore. There's a beefed-up technical section, and the 6 chapters provide lively reports. Perhaps the least architectural cover ever, and there's a series of the covers, is that one with all 5 key party leaders writing for the quarterly. The Christmas issue, I'm glad to say, has a much jollier cover. Some old friends depart. My deputy, Sharon McCord, sadly died of cancer, and we produced that publication in very short order. Stuart Campbell donated his essays, and so far we've raised about £20,000 for the hospice in honour of Sharon. Izzy met Stein, who, along with his business partner, Andy McMillan, were among the most prominent, vociferous and amusing architect commentators in Scotland, left the stage in early 2012, and he was joined by Andy in the summer of 2014. Now, if you can't read that, the top bit is Andy misspelling my name, and the bottom bit is, to Neil, I hope you get as much enjoyment from one of Andy's so rare mistakes as I have. Best wishes, Izzy. We had, in the issue of the magazine when Izzy died, we had a lot of Izzyisms, comments from the late Professor Stein, who, when he was in a wheelchair at the end of his life, somebody asked, what, was sympathising with his condition, and he said, less of a centaur than half man, half shopping trolley. But the quarterly continues its mission, 100 pages at a time, to change hearts and minds and engage with Civic Scotland. And that note brings us rather neatly on to the largest and certainly the widest ranging event to attempt to do that, the Festival of Architecture 2016. The aims to underpin and complement public policy. You have to say that or the government won't give you money. Enhance international reputation, legacy, reach wide audiences, etc. We've got, actually, these slides, every time I produce a slide on this, the figures change. We've now got over 90 partners, including governments. I'll come on to some of the partners in a minute. We've got national press and media partners. We've got transport partners. Scot Rail, Logan Air have just signed up. And those calculations are relatively conservative. That's the sort of thing that you have to set out in order to raise the finance for what we're endeavouring to do. The structure of the festival is all there. There's a governance group. The Year of Innovation, Architecture and Design sits to one side of that. We have a forum. We have an appointed director, Karen Cunningham, and 2 RIS coordinators, an additional exhibitions person, and our graphic and IT person, as well as the operations group of the incorporation, and a separate PR and marketing consultancy. And the identity, extensive online presence, bold striking graphics, etc., so that there will be coherence across all the productions during the festival. I've mentioned that we do aim ultimately to ensure that Scotland has the best recorded architecture of any nation, and there will be a lot of apps. These are some of the partners, by no means all. Other partners include the Dutch and Danish governments who came and knocked at our door, I'm glad to say, and kind of invited themselves in. They were very warmly welcomed, of course. Still waiting for David Cameron. The headline events I'll describe shortly. This is just a graph of some of the delivery. You'll appreciate that the incorporation with 6 area chapters, it would have been inappropriate and unworkable to impose on each of the chapters for the whole year because it's all voluntary. So effectively what we said to each of the chapters was choose a month and animate your month. So Glasgow in March, one of the things that they're doing to animate their month is they're producing an architectural beer, which I'm sure will animate the month very vividly. And there's a whole series of events being created by all the chapters. In addition, we've got other organisations that are creating focal events. So you'll see from there that, you know, in addition to the 6 chapters, we've got 7 other organisations that are producing events. So to animate the 8 months of the festival so far, we've got 13 months of animation. Events across 32 local authorities. This ripple diagram, again, needs to be amended because there are now many more events. Somebody pointed out that there wasn't a lot happening in Portree. There are, in fact, now 3 events happening in Portree, so anybody going to Portree next year has a good chance of coming across a festival event. 400 plus events across Scotland. That figure actually arises from the Charles McKean 1984 festival, and it was the figure that we latched upon pretty early. We're going to significantly build upon the 400 events. Hinterland, this first event at St Peter's College, Kilmahue, by the late and aforementioned Andy and Izzy. Obviously, the greatest, most substantial modernist ruin in Scotland. It's going to be reconfigured by the company NVA, which is an arts consultancy. But the first event, or one of the first events of the festival, is a series of musical and light events through this in a series of evenings in March. Let's hope it doesn't rain. The Ideal Hut Show. George Clark might have come upon the idea of small buildings and their adaptation, but the first version of the Ideal Hut Show illustrated here was 1999, so George, eat your heart out, we got there first. Adventures in Space, the architecture of science fiction. Pop-up World Cities Expo at Mound Square, Edinburgh, and thus far I think we've got 10 cities signed up. We're waiting for New York, and I know that as soon as New York's in, we'll have an avalanche. We've got invitations out to about another 10, but we can only take 14 in total, so we're not too far off our target. Scot style, 100 buildings from the last century in Scotland, 10 per decade, so we're not doing that skewing of dates thing and applying dates erroneously to buildings to confuse historians of the future. Out of their heads, Sir Robert Rowan Anderson illustrated there the simple thesis of that, and it's on at the National Portrait Gallery from June. It might actually be on until February 2017, but the simple thesis is that architectural creativity comes out of the head of the architect. So that's the thesis that underpins that event. We're going to try and complete the series, not next year, but over the next 3 years of RIAS architectural guides, and take them online. So effectively, you'll be able to explore Scottish architecture no matter where you are on the planet, by building type, by architect, by a whole range of different search mechanisms. And you know, that greatly improves. In addition to the Dictionary of Scottish Architects, it just means that Scottish architecture is well and truly out there, and certainly very well reported. We need lots of new photography, so if people are willing photographers, then speak to me later. The finale, I'm not supposed to talk about it, but I think it's fairly well out of the bag that it's going to be in Dundee. And it's going to be in what one of our Dundee city partners described as the amphitheatre of the Tay, which I quite liked as a description, and which his boss liked even more and wrote down, so it will come back credited to him. And that's me done, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. Do we have any comments or questions from the audience? Perhaps maybe somebody from Dundee who wants to take issue. One or two things. Yes, gentleman here.
I wondered why you hadn't mentioned things like the lighthouse and the homes for the future in Glasgow, and the anticipation initially that the lighthouse would be one of a network of centres of design and architecture across Scotland, which never ever materialised. And I'm just wondering now whether with all these events that you're nurturing, various levels in different places, whether that might have some kind of forward momentum. In other words, it would be a shame if these things just happened and then just like a squib vanished, and that there wasn't some kind of ongoing legacy. And I just wondered whether that was part of the plan as well, that a bit like the Olympics, that would be some kind of succession, if you like.
Yeah, the reason I didn't mention the Lighthouse, Homes for the Future and various other initiatives, really they weren't directly the incorporations. So I tried to stick to the incorporation's endeavours. As far as the festival is concerned, among our partners are the Children's Parliament, Children in Scotland and Education Scotland, and there is a huge amount that's happening educationally, as well as many of the major festivals and existing events. And the idea is that we will create educational materials that will go forward. We'll also create, there's a lot of legacy. There isn't really a better word to describe, effectively what leads on from the festival. I mean, I do think the fact that we've already got an exhibition that's heading over into the following year is quite useful and is a sort of immediate legacy. But there are all sorts of things happening. There's a big strand of activity within the festival on Peter Womersley, whose Five Houses essay you saw there. And there's a new focus on him. And the idea is that there will be Womersley trails. It's going to be a new book. There are a whole series of books and publications. I didn't cover all of these because it struck me I could go on talking just about the festival for a very, very long time. There's lots of very specific content. There's Frank Walker's The Scottishness of Scottish Architecture, which I was working on some of the edits at the weekend there. There are, as I say, a whole number of publications. I think the biggest potential legacy is that thing of taking Charles McKean's amazing legacy of the architectural guides and taking that online and actually, taking that the next step. Because obviously there are a lot of people who have the published guides, but once it's online, it's available to everyone. And the huge amount, I mean, I shudder to think how many millions of words of descriptions of Scottish buildings that are contained in the existing architectural guides and the few guides that we've yet to complete. And, most of them have been commissioned or certainly in discussion. It's just, in terms of potential legacies, that's enormous. The whole intention is that this is not an architectural, try and persuade some architects of this, but this is not an architectural festival by architects for architects. This is an event that is about fun and engagement and involving as wide as possible the Scottish community as we possibly can. So the whole idea is to create events that will, stimulate people and involve people. So for example, there's a huge part of next year's Festival of Politics at the Scottish Parliament is on the Festival of Architecture and on architectural themes. So essentially it's about just raising the status and awareness of architecture. and hopefully in the process encouraging people to engage more and to actually get the point that good architecture in communities is actually good for people and beneficial for people and will, you know, benefit, improve the quality of their daily lives, because that's something we've been advocating for a century so far.
Yes.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, you can hear me. I think Neil's been slightly disingenuous. Of course, he'd just gone local. That's why he didn't mention Glasgow anymore. He couldn't resist the pop at the festival, but other than that. But I found it really interesting, because it's always good to look back at a bit. You know, you keep chugging on during the day. And but I did think you may have missed a point. When John Ford's, when you quoted him on banks and development and so on, absolutely right. And the next photograph, or the next but one, was the fire station. And of course, in smaller print, it said Lothian Regional Council Architects Department. And of course, at that period, not just them, but Edinburgh and all cities and so on. And that's partly the reference to the President's comments on politics and so on. And what has been lost, it seems to me, at least there was a competition there between private and public. Now the public is done in exactly the same way. And I was wondering whether there were going to be any architectural competitions that, I mean, when you quoted Penny Lewis about the, you know, it is the case that good architectural competitions done publicly and properly excite a lot of interest. Of course, if they're done badly, like a recent one in Glasgow, can also excite a lot of interest. But even that, in a sense, is a good thing. It's a bit like, you know, no publicity is bad publicity. At least there's some genuine debate about architecture and design and social issues. And one of the things that seems to have been sorely lacking in Scotland over the last 10 or 15 years has been any proper architectural competitions. It would be really good if the government would maybe put its mouth where its gobshite comes out and just commission some, or even instruct Scottish Futures Trust, instead of passing over these crap buildings to builders, to actually have some competitions. We rely upon you, Neil.
I completely concur with your views. I should say that the competition for George Square, Glasgow, was an excellent piece of administration delivery and good judgment on the part of the late David Mackey, Andy McMillan and the other judges, with one notable exception, who was the then council leader, no longer the council leader. He simply threw his toys out the pram because he didn't get his own way, which is an inappropriate way for anyone, far less the leader of a major public authority, to act. As I say, I was going to say he's no longer with us. That makes him sound more dead than just politically dead, but he has gone into a political dark place, and we're hopeful that rather more positive things will happen vis-a-vis competitions in Glasgow. There are a series of small competitions relating to the festival. I was talking to a developer today, strangely, a housing developer, big housing developer, about a potential Expo-style competition for new house types. So that's quite interesting. That's something that hasn't really happened in Scotland on individual house types since, you know, the 1930s, the house that Jean built, which was run through the Daily Record. So that's quite positive. The number of competitions is actually increasing in number, and we are now getting more larger projects coming back. Another of the points you raised was the fact that that building was created by a local authority, and tremendous piece of work that it is. There's only one local authority now in Scotland that has somebody whose job title is city architect, and that's Dundee. And the city that is moving forward and doing the most architecturally in terms of its built environment in Scotland, well, that would be Dundee. And I don't think there's any coincidence there. The local authority architect historically did two really important things. One, they saved the local authority money by designing some buildings which were in their range of specialisation, which were appropriate. Many of them designed local schools. But the other crucially important thing that they did was they acted as the expert client. And the expert client being lost from many local authorities because they simply don't employ architects at a sufficient level of expertise or professionalism. They're buying in architects who don't have the background and experience very often on short-term contracts. So you don't get any continuity of service, you don't get the quality of delivery that historically we've had. And councils are now seeing the effects of that, and some of the effects of it have already ended up in the courts. So hopefully they will learn from Dundee's good example and start redeploying city architects. I'll certainly be advocating that in local authorities whenever I have the chance to meet their leaders. I'll be meeting the new leader of the City of Glasgow relatively soon, and I will be making the point as strongly as I can, because I think that's absolutely crucial. The balance between public sector and private sector is skewed and out of kilter, and they both have historically worked very well together, as you pointed out.
Yes, Matt.
As you approach the 100th anniversary, do you think that the RIAS has the function that Anderson wanted for it, or has it changed a lot? And do all architects working in Scotland feel that they need to belong, and do they also still belong to the RIBA?
Very loaded. We have, since the 1980s, one of the other wonderful things that Charles McKean did, he formed a partnership agreement with the RIBA. So the majority of chartered members of the incorporation are joint members of RIS and RIBA and benefit from both, and benefit from the work of both in different political forums. So I think that's crucially important. As far as the ongoing role of the incorporation, we are now standing at 4,800 members. At the point where Sebastian Toombs was interviewed in the magazine, it was at 3,800. Now, an additional 1,000 doesn't sound like a huge number, but actually when you're talking about a finite profession within a relatively small country, that's quite positive, and it's a positive indication that we're getting lots of younger people in. A significant proportion of that number are students, of course, but what we're finding is that the students are going on to become full members of the incorporation. As far as the service of the incorporation and the relevance of the incorporation is concerned, I think after a century, obviously it needs to refresh itself and reinvent itself at various stages. Historically, it had a disciplinary role, and it's handed that disciplinary role to the Architects Registration Board for good or ill, but that was the determination of the RIS Council some time ago, simply because the sheer cost of litigation could at any stage have taken out an organisation of the scale of the RIS. So the pragmatic judgment was that the Architects Registration Board, which is a UK organisation, would take on that disciplinary role. It means that we are, caretakers of the profession. We don't have to do any of the nasty stuff, which is good in terms of membership loyalty. We now defend them, and indeed on occasion we defend them against the vagaries and rather odd decision making on occasion of the Architects Registration Board. Joint members, we are at about 1,900 joint RIS, RIBA, and about 600 to 700 RIS only among our mainstream chartered members, and then the rest of the members are retirees, the majority of whom are only RIS, because our retired class of membership is free of charge, and the RIBA insist on continuing to charge its retirees, so everybody retires and leaves, which is just madness. And, because if people have paid into the organisation sometimes for 50 years, then surely they're deserving of a little sort of, I was going to say terminal bonus, but you know what I mean. A bonus at the end of their long service and their continuing contributions to the incorporation. So in addition, we have a significant group of honorary fellows And we have a very strong community of fellows. Andy McMillan, the late Andy McMillan, said apropos the honorary fellows of the Incorporation, I think there are 1 or 2 in this room, but his comment apropos the honorary fellows was, given that he looked at the number of politicians we had, and people in the arts, and people in business, and, you know, people in different areas of Scottish life, and his comment was, so when are you proposing to march on London with this phalanx of honorary fellows? So we've got a good, healthy membership at the moment, and very, very engaged. And I'm delighted to say really engaged at the younger members, and the festival has really galvanised the younger members throughout the chapters in particular. There's some tremendous activity which is being undertaken by, you know, people in their late 20s, early 30s who are fully committed to the work of their local chapters. And it is ultimately, I mean, I'm one of the employees. I'm one of the servants of the Incorporation. The Incorporation employs roughly 20 people, full and part-time. But the 4,800 members are the Incorporation, and their voluntary endeavour is the bulk of the work of the Incorporation. Always has been. And it couldn't be done otherwise.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your comments from the audience. And thank you very much indeed, Neil, for your presentation tonight. As antiquaries, it occurs to me that we've been hearing tonight about a parallel organisation, almost a parallel world, with very familiar names and buildings seen from a different viewpoint. For it must have been about 100 years, the Society, of course, was associated with one of the outstanding buildings you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, what's now known as the Portrait Gallery by Sir Robert, which is a splendid building for us to work in, where we had our museum and our library and our meetings until relatively recently. And at the very end of my career, I had the pleasure, in fact, to work with Charles McKean. Indeed, I was working with him on supervising a student right up to his untimely death. And it's fascinating to hear how much he is admired in his own world. He was certainly, you can never doubt, he was a very considerable scholar, learned man, and an incredible enthusiast who has left not a great deal for your world, but ours as well. It was a fascinating presentation tonight, and I think it's given us a great deal to learn and to think about as we move forward ourselves and have opportunities to project archaeology in 2017. So very grateful indeed, and I'd ask you to express your thanks in the usual way.